The defeat of the Polish army in the Battle of Stalingrad and the counterattacks of the Red Army, followed in the winter of 1943, led to the liberation of the vast territories of the country and the transition of a strategic initiative to Soviet troops. It is noteworthy that it was during this period that Stalin first spoke about the post-war world at a meeting with foreign correspondents on February 23, 1943, which testified to the growth of the political confidence of the Soviet leadership. However, in March, the offensive of the Red Army in Ukraine was stopped. The Germans threw reserves from France to this direction and inflicted an unexpected counterattack. This was made possible due to the fact that Hitler, contrary to the objections of Rommel, removed 3 selected tank divisions from the Western Front, which subsequently loosened the defense in Normandy before the Allies. As a result, Kharkov and Belgorod and the surrounding territories were again left. At the end of March, the spring thaw began, and parts of the Wehrmacht received an order to go to defense. According to the results of the Red Army, in the winter of 1943 in eastern Ukraine and the subsequent counterattack of the Wehrmacht in the center of the Soviet-German front, a protrusion of up to 150 and up to 200 kilometers was formed, which later received the name of the Kursk Arc. The geometry of this ledge was so unprofitable for defense that many German generals proposed to allocate troops, but Hitler insisted on the offensive, wanting to restore the prestige of Germany after Stalingrad. At that time, none of the parties had fully owned a strategic initiative, so any mistake in the future planning could lead to tragic consequences. In turn, the German command decided to conduct a strategic offensive operation, during which 2 blows in converging directions from the north and south to surround and destroy Soviet troops in the Kursk protrusion, take possession of the strategic initiative and turn the course of the war in their favor. It is noteworthy that the initial plan provided for the beginning of the operation in May, but Manstein insisted on waiting for the new Panther tanks, which became a fatal delay. For this, a military operation under the code name Citadel was approved in April 1943. German documents emphasized that the success of the operation was to return the trust of the German allies, which indicates the growing political isolation of the Reich. The North FAS Arc was to attack the Army Group Center, which was commanded by Walter, and the Army Group of the South, under the command of Erich von Manstein, acted on the southern faculty of the Army Group. The importance of the upcoming operation is also evidenced by the fact that Walter, before the operation, personally carried out aerial photography of Soviet positions on a light plane, which was not characteristic for generals of such a rank. However, Soviet military intelligence managed to timely reveal the training of the German army for a major attack on the Kursk Arc. Largely thanks to the Cambridge 5 agents and the Dora Group, the most important intelligence were obtained about the general plan of Operation Citadel. It was during this period that Soviet intelligence in Switzerland intercepted important data that Japan would not attack the USSR, which allowed to transfer fresh divisions from the Far East. After analyzing the situation, the raid decided to go to defense in the Kursk ledge and during the defensive battle to bleed the enemy's strike groups in order to subsequently create favorable conditions for the transfer of Soviet troops into a counterattack. This decision became a turning point in military art. For the first time in history, the Red Army deliberately chose defense as an active form of struggle, which was later studied in all military academies of the world. Initially, the deadline for the start of the operation was appointed Hitler on May 3. However, most of the German generals, relying on intelligence data, was alarmed by the power of Soviet defensive fortifications and advocated that it was first necessary to accumulate enough strength and form as many tank units as possible, as a result of which the terms of the offensive were shifted to July. This delay had strategic consequences. It was in June that Italy began secret negotiations with the Allies, and Turkey finally refused to enter the war on the side of Germany. The German command had special hopes for the use of new samples of military equipment, such as the Tiger and Panther tanks and the Ferdinand assault guns. Technical statistics. Out of the 200 latest Panther, by the beginning of the onset of 16, they failed on the way to the front due to technical defects. This machine was so raw. For the Operation Citadel, the most combat-ready formations of a total of 50 divisions were involved. The grouping of German troops totaled 780,000 people. about 10,000 guns and mortars, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 2,050 aircraft. The political aspect. In these troops there were representatives of all allies of Germany, from the Croatian infantry battalions to the Spanish Blue Division, which made a possible defeat especially sensitive to the prestige of the Reich. They were opposed by the central front of Rokossovsky and Voronezh front Vatutin. It is noteworthy that Rokossovsky, contrary to standard practice, placed the main forces not in the first line of defense, but in the second, which was completely disoriented by German intelligence. By the beginning of July, under the leadership of the Army General Rokossovsky, there were 712,000 people, 1,800 tanks and self-propelled artillery attitudes, 12,000 guns and mortars. It was in this battle that the new anti-tank guns of Simonov were used for the first time, which could break through the side armor of the Tigers from 300 meters. In turn, the Voronezh front totaled 626,000 people, 1,700 tanks, and almost 9,000 guns and mortars. Vatutin ordered to equip every third firing point as false, which forced the Germans to waste ammunition. In addition, several armies of the Steppe Military District, which were in the reserve, were lined up at the base of the ledge. The frontline strip was literally turned into a huge fortress. The Soviet units had powerful echelon defense in 3 stripes saturated with anti-tank weapons. For the first time, a single system of anti-tank regions was created, each of which included 4 to 6 guns, 2 to 3 anti-tank rifles, sappers and shooters. This experience was later adopted by all Allied armies. In particular, only 4,200 kilometers of the trench were dug in the strip of the Voronezh front. 500 kilometers of anti-tank barriers were built. Every 5th minefield was equipped with cunning mines that worked not from the first press, which significantly increased the losses of German sappers. The general coordination of the actions of the fronts was entrusted with representatives of the Rate, marshals of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. It was during the Battle of Kursk that Zhukov introduced the practice of night councils of the command. When all decisions were made after a thorough analysis of daytime battles, this method later became the standard in the Soviet army. It is worth noting that the main problem of defense on the Kursk arc was a lack of heavy artillery. Soviet light guns were useless against new German tanks, and new heavy guns had just entered production, and obviously did not have time to start the battle. It was this problem that made the evacuation of industry in the Urals. The new workshops in Chelyabinsk began to give products a body month earlier than the planned deadline. Then it was decided to apply the new tactics of defense. Historical significance. This tactics, developed by the artilleryman Nedelin, formed the basis of all post-war Soviet charters on anti-tank defense. If earlier anti-tank guns were built in one line along the front, now they were combined into anti-tank strongholds. Tactical cunning. Between the strongholds specially left the corridors, where German tanks were lured under a flank fire. If enemy tanks tried to break through between the strongholds, the guns opened fire on their more vulnerable onboard armor. This tactic increased the effectiveness of anti-tank defense by 3 to 4 times compared to 1941. Meanwhile, a long delay in the transition of the Germans on the offensive forced Stalin himself nervous. As the declassified archives showed, it was these days that Stalin first discussed the plans of the post-war structure of Europe with Molotov and Beria, which indicates his confidence in victory. However, soon the captured German sapper dispelled the last doubts. During interrogation, he extremely frankly said that German troops on July 5 at 2 a.m., to European time, will go on the offensive. This sapper was not a simple soldier, but an engineer from the headquarters of the 6th Infantry Division, which made his testimony especially valuable. At the same time, the headquarters of the Central and Voronezh fronts decided to make artillery counterattacks on the night of July 5, as a result of which, the part of the SS unit of the SS Wehrmacht carried out losses and began the offensive a little later than the planned time. This counterattack destroyed up to 30% of German artillery in the advanced parts, which seriously weakened their shock power. At 6 o'clock in the morning, German artillery was unprecedented in power. The Germans first used new acoustic locators to adjust the Arthrus, but Soviet troops successfully disoriented them, creating false noise effects. The giant avalanche of fire fell on Soviet positions. Following the fire shaft, the entire military power of the Reich, which was pulled under Kursk for several months, set in motion. As prisoners showed, many German soldiers believed that after such artillery, Russians simply could not resist. This calculation turned out to be a fatal mistake. The tank columns of the Nazis with a steel wedge moved to our trenches. The scout of the 222nd Guards Rifle Regiment, Lev Malakin, recalled about the beginning of the Operation Citadel operation. The enemy's artillery is continued in the regiment's defense strip for more than an hour. Personal certificate. In his memoirs, Malakin especially noted that after the artillery, only 3 survived in the first line, but the surviving fighters immediately took positions. A fierce battle flared over the entire defense lane. Under the cover of a smoke curtain, the Nazis went to storm. There was unbearable heat under plus 35 degrees C, which caused frequent overheating of engines in German tanks and increased their vulnerability. In the offensive on the northern facet of the Kursk Arc, the Germans used high technologies of that time to break through passages in minefields used by the Borgard radio-controlled wedges. Technical incident. Out of 150 launched tankers, only 35 completed the task. The rest either lost control or blown up on unaccounted Soviet trains. However, a large number of funnels from shells on the battlefield prevented the Ferdinandum from recognizing the passages made by the tanks, which were not indicated in any way, as a result of which the Ferdinanda began to go astray and undermine one after another. In addition, the Soviet anti-tankmen broke the chassis of the Ferdinands, thereby immobilizing giant armored vehicles. Tactical find. The fighters quickly found that armor. Piercing bullets of large caliber machine guns, DSK effectively damaged the chassis of these machines when firing on board from close distances. It should be noted that by the evening of the first day of the offensive, half of them failed. On the northern front of the Kursk Arc, German troops dealt the main blow in the direction of Olkhovatka in the band of the 13th Army of Pukov. Operational trick. The Soviet command specifically left a weakly fortified area in front of Olkhovatka, where the main blow headed, then falling under cross fire from the flanks. Fierce battles unfolded around the entire perimeter of the front. In the very first hours of the battle, the commander of the Central Front, Rokossovsky, introduced the 2nd Tank Army of Lieutenant General Rodin, but the counterattack was not successful. As Rokossovsky later admitted in the memoirs, the introduction of tanks into battle in small groups without proper art support was forced, but a serious tactical mistake. By the end of the first day of the offensive, the Germans managed to break through the first lane of defense of the Soviet troops, advance by 8 kilometers, and go to the second defense lane in the North Olkhovatka area. But in the future, without success, on July 9, the model struck a blow in the direction of the Ponyri railway station. The large forces of the heavy armored vehicles of the Wehrmacht managed to break deep into the rear of the Soviet units that defended the ditch. Engineering feat. Soviet sappers in one night installed around the station for more than 6,000 minutes, including the latest tension mines at that time. However, here the Germans fell into the firebag of several fighter fraud, tank artillery regiments, and ultimately could not break through the Soviet defense. Having met the stubborn resistance of the defending Soviet troops, the German command introduced almost all the formations of the Army Group of Army Group. According to the testimony of prisoners, it was after the fighting for the pipe in the German units that rumors began to spread about the new Russian tactics, when they were supposedly specially lured into pre-prepared zones of death. After several days of fierce battles, neither under Olkhovatka nor under the Dies, it was not possible to achieve decisive success. By July 12, the offensive capabilities of the Walter Model Group on the northern front of the Kursk Arc drove. He was forced to stop attacks and move on to defense. It was on July 12 that Mussolini was arrested in Italy, which was directly connected with the failure of the Citadel. German propaganda tried to refute these rumors, but the morale of the troops was seriously undermined. Fights in the following days did not bring even limited tactical successes to the Germans. If the Central Front already on the 5th day of the battle managed to stabilize its defense, then on the Voronezh front the situation at that moment was close to critical. It was on these days that Stalin made an unprecedented decision to transfer part of the strategic reserves from under Moscow, risking the security of the capital. The threat of a breakthrough seemed so serious. Moreover, the terrain contributed to the conduct of maneuvering war and the constant transfer of the tide of the main blow, since the southern FAS Kursk arc had a unique relief with numerous beams and ravines, which Soviet troops skillfully used reserves for a secretive maneuver. By analogy with Ferdinand's, in the same way, on the southern front of the Kursk ledge, the Tigers and Panthers were met with a hurricane artillery fire, which greatly complicated mine clearance. The new Panthers were extremely vulnerable to the lower part of the sides. The Soviet armor breasters quickly learned to hit them, shooting at an angle through the slopes of the ravines. As a result, the Tigers were blown up on the uninhabited mines and failed even with impenetrated armor. He lost his Tiger, running up to Mini on July 5, and the future German tank ace Michael Wittmann. After that, Wittmann moved to the usual Panzerkampfwagen 4th. The enemy's tank and infantry divisions literally linked in the labyrinth of the stripes of Soviet fortifications, but the combat experience of German troops and their new equipment still did their job. German commanders began to practice night attacks of infantry without tank support, which for the first time in the war gave them some tactical success against Soviet defense. The Germans began to focus their forces in narrow areas. Manstein personally ordered to create special assault groups from sappers and flamethrower to break through Soviet fortifications. This experience was later used by the Self-Aprist Wehrmacht until the end of the war. It is worth noting that on the first day of the battle on the Kursk arc, Manstein's group supported almost 400 aircraft. A hail of air bombs crushed one anti-tank support point after another. For the first time, Soviet anti-aircraft guns used the tactics of pneumatic batteries. Quickly changing their positions after each shelling, they were able to maintain 80% of their artillery. As a result, by July 8, drumming units of German motorized formations and several tank divisions of the 4th Panzer Army, Gotha and the Kempf Group broke through 2 defense strips of the Voronezh front and wedged into the depths of more than 20 kilometers. German tankers, accustomed to open areas, did not expect to meet in the steppes disguised trenches of a full profile with logs of logs. To eliminate the breakthrough, Vatutin threw his reserves into battle, the 1st Panzer Army Katukov and the 5th Guards Tank Corps of Lieutenant General Kravchenko. Katukov ordered his tankers to take their positions in the reverse slopes of heights, which deprived the German Tigers of their main advantage, long term. Despite this, our troops suffered heavy losses. In particular, in one day of the fighting, only the Kravchenko Corps lost about 100 tanks. The analysis of the bumped T-34 showed that 70% of the hits were in the frontal part. Meanwhile, the German command sought to capitalize on their success by continuing to increase their efforts along the Belgorod-Oboyan highway. As it turned out, the German repair services were not prepared for the massive breakdowns of the Panthers, and 40% of the tanks of this type that were disabled were never returned to service. By the end of July 9, Paul Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps had not only broken through to the 3rd defensive line, but had also managed to penetrate approximately 9 kilometers southwest of Prokhorovka. It was at this point that Hauser made a fatal mistake, spending 12 hours regrouping instead of capitalizing on his success. However, the Germans failed to break out of the operational expanse. On July 10, Hitler ordered the commander of the Army Group South to achieve a decisive fracture during the battle, making sure that the Voronezh front's troops were completely inability to break the resistance of the Voronezh front in the Oboyansk direction. Field Marshal Manstein decided to change the direction of the main blow and now stepped on Kursk through Prokhorovka. This order coincided with the landing of the Allies in Sicily, which forced Hitler to think for the first time about the transfer of part of the forces to the Western Front. In turn, to disrupt the offensive and defeat of the enemy's strike group, the command of the Voronezh front undressed on July 12, a counterattack, which later entered history as Prokhorovka tank battle. The morning of July 12 was unusually foggy, which prevented Soviet aviation from maintaining the attack, but also deprived the Germans of the advantage in targeted shooting. From the very beginning of the offensive of the Soviet troops, it became obvious that the counterattack was clearly developing not according to plan. In just one day of the battles, the 5th Guards Tank Army of Rotmistrov forced to advance in a narrow corridor between the Sel River and the railway, lost 340 tanks and could not go to the Yakovlevo area. The density of tanks in some areas reached 150 cars per square kilometer, which made any maneuver impossible. Nevertheless, despite significant losses, the troops of the Voronezh front, who defended the area near Prokhorovka until July 16, fulfilled their task and prevented the Germans from breaking through the defenses and gaining operational freedom. On July 16, by order of Manstein, the allocation of the main forces of the Army Group South began to its original positions. Many German soldiers later recalled that it was after July 16 that they first doubted the victory of Germany. The Germans simply had nothing to advance. On this, the defensive phase of the Battle of Kursk came to an end. On July 12, in the northern section of the Kursk Arc, the Red Army went on the offensive as part of the previously planned Operation Kutuz in order to prevent the Nazis to transfer additional reserves under Kursk. This offensive began intentionally a day earlier than Prokhorov's battle in order to deprive Manstein's model. The second stage of the Kursk battle began. At the same time, the troops of the Voronezh and steppe fronts, persecuting the departing enemy troops, by July 23, reached the borders occupied before the start of the defensive operation, and on August 3, they had already transferred to the counteroffensive on the Belgorod-Kharkov direction,